fields. The fog came in thick off the Northumberland Strait that morning, rolling across the shore like something alive, swallowing the tree line and the gravel parking lot, and the flashing lights of the RCMP vehicles, one by one, until the whole staging area at the edge of Wentworth Provincial Park felt like it existed inside a cloud. Corporal Tyler Noonan stood at the rear of the mobile command unit, clipboard in hand, jaw set hard against the cold and the pressure, and the fact that everything, as from the weather to the timeline to his own composure, was working against him. A 9-year-old boy named Callum Price had been missing since 4 o'clock the previous afternoon. 17 hours. The child had wandered away from a church group camping trip near the falls and had not been seen since. Hours in the Nova Scotia backcountry in early October, with overnight lows dipping to 3 degrees, was a window that was rapidly closing. Noonan knew the statistics. He had studied them at Depot Division in Regina, memorized the survival curves, rehearsed the protocols. He was 27 years old, 18 months out of training, Eshifolds, and this was his first time as incident commander on a major search and rescue operation. Had been given the role because everyone more senior was either deployed to the flooding in the Annapolis Valley or attending a conference in Ottawa. The timing was catastrophic, and the weight of it sat on his shoulders like wet concrete. Behind him, lined up along the gravel shoulder of the access road, were 3 RCMP police dog service vehicles, rear compartments, open and ventilated, each housing a trained German shepherd. As were general-purpose police service dogs, cross-trained in tracking and criminal apprehension, the best the Halifax detachment could muster on short notice. Their handlers, Constables Firth, Lemieux, and Baxter, were checking harnesses and talking in low, efficient voices. In addition to the RCMP dogs, a volunteer search and rescue team from Truro had brought 2 more dogs, a Labrador and a Bloodhound, for a total of 5 canine assets on the ground. It should have been enough, as not going well. The problem had started an hour ago when the dogs were brought to the last known position, a clearing near campsite 12 where the boy's sleeping bag and 1 small running shoe had been found. The RCMP shepherds had picked up the scent immediately, their noses dropping to the forest floor, their bodies taut with purpose. And then, one by one, they had stopped. Not lost the scent. Stopped, lifted their heads, turned in small, confused circles, and refused to advance. Constable Lemieux's dog, a 5-year-old male named Gunner, had actually backed up, eshing himself against Lemieux's legs and whimpering. The behavior was unprecedented. These dogs had tracked fugitives through swamps, located cadavers buried under rubble, worked without hesitation in conditions far worse than a foggy forest in the Cobequids. There they were, balking at a trail that should have been fresh and obvious. Lemieux had tried twice more. Same result. The dog would track for 30 meters, hit an invisible wall, and shut down. The volunteer dogs fared no better. The Bloodhound, a seasoned animal with hundreds of successful tracks, simply sat down at the threshold of the tree line and howled, a long, dusty fields. Mournful sound that echoed through the fog and made every searcher on the ground stop and listen with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The fields. Noonan was running out of options and running out of time. The ground search teams were spread across a 2-kilometer grid. The helicopter was grounded by the fog. The thermal drone had a cracked rotor housing and was being repaired in the back of someone's pickup truck. The dogs were the best tool he had, and the dogs were broken. That was when the old man appeared. He came out of the fog on foot, walking up the access road from the direction of the highway, with the slow, unhurried gait of a man who had long ago decided that the world could wait for him. The shoulder. He was tall, but stooped at the shoulders. The kind of stoop that comes not from weakness but from a lifetime of ducking through doorways built for shorter men. He wore a faded Carhartt jacket, the color of strong tea, canvas, work pants, and rubber boots caked with dried mud that was clearly not from this particular piece of ground. His face was lean and deeply lined, weathered to the color and texture of old barnboard, and a gray wool cap was pulled low over his ears. Nothing but a thermos and a calm that seemed almost offensive given the circumstances. He stopped at the yellow tape perimeter and stood there, watching. Not gawking station fields. Not craning his neck like the handful of locals who had gathered near the road with their Tim Hortons cups and their hushed speculation. He was watching the way a man watches a job being done, with appraisal, with patience, and with the quiet, unmistakable air of someone who knows exactly what he is looking at. Constable Elaine Firth noticed him first. She was the senior handler on the detail, a 15-year veteran of the police dog service, with tours in Nunavut and northern Manitoba, upper. A woman who had spent more nights sleeping next to a dog in a snowbank than in her own bed. She was crouched beside her shepherd, a female named Riva, Uffy Fields, trying for the third time to coax the animal past the invisible barrier at the tree line, and getting nowhere. Glanced up, scanning the perimeter out of habit, and her eyes snagged on the old man. There was something about his stillness. In a scene full of movement, full of radios crackling and boots crunching and voices calling grid coordinates into the fog, he was perfectly, unnervingly still. He stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, his weight centered, his hands at his sides. It was not the stillness of inaction. It was the stillness of a man who was processing, cataloging, deciding. Akshufee. Firth had seen that kind of stillness before. In the old-timers at the dog training center in Innisfail, the retired handlers who would come to watch the new classes, and who could diagnose a training problem from 50 meters away without saying a word. She filed it away and turned back to Riva. Escher. Corporal Noonan noticed the old man 10 minutes later, after receiving a radio update that the ground teams had found nothing. After arguing with dispatch about the helicopter, staring at the map until the contour lines blurred. He noticed him because the man had moved. He had not crossed the tape, but he had shifted his position, walking along the perimeter in a slow, deliberate arc until he was standing directly downwind of the dog vehicles. And the dogs had noticed him. Ava, still at the tree line with Firth, had turned her head and was staring at the old man with an intensity that Firth had never seen directed at a bystander. Not aggressive, not fearful. Locked on, the way she locked on a suspect in a building search, every fiber of her being oriented toward a single point in space. Gunner, back in his vehicle, Ejani, had risen from his resting position and was pressing his nose against the ventilation grate, his nostrils flaring. A low, resonant whine was building in his chest. The third RCMP shepherd, a young male named Atlas, had begun to pace in his compartment, his claws ticking against the floor in a rapid, agitated rhythm. Just Noonan walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel. The old man did not turn, did not acknowledge his approach. His pale gray eyes were fixed on Riva, and there was something in his expression that Noonan, in his inexperience, could not read. It looked like recognition. Animal. Sir, I'm going to need you to step back from the vehicles. This is an active search area, and we can't have civilians interfering with the animals. The old man finally looked at him. His eyes were startling up close. Not just gray, but a silvered blue, like lake ice in February. And they carried a depth of assessment that made Noonan feel, for a brief and unsettling moment, I was the one being evaluated. Wasn't planning on interfering, the man said. His voice was low and unhurried, the consonants rounded with that particular rural Nova Scotia cadence that turns car into something softer and stretches vowels like taffy. Heard the boy's been missing since yesterday. Thought I might be of some help. Noonan's jaw tightened. He had been fielding offers of help all morning, from well-meaning locals with no training, from retired volunteer firefighters who hadn't hiked a trail in a decade, from a man who claimed his border collie could track anything. Each offer cost him time and patience he did not have. "We appreciate that, sir, but we have trained personnel and trained animals handling the search. All you can do is stay behind the line and let us work." The old man nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has heard something predictable and is not offended by it. "Your dogs won't track," he said. It was not a question. Noonan stiffened. "Our dogs are working the scent." "No, they're not." The old man's voice carried no challenge, no condescension. It was the flat, caustic tone of a mechanic, telling you your alternator is shot. "They hit the tree line and they quit." The male backed up on his handler. The bloodhound sat down and sang. "You've tried 3 times at least, probably 4, and you're standing here talking to me instead of running the grid because you've run out of ideas and the clock is getting loud." Noonan felt the blood rise to his face. The assessment was precise, clinical, and completely accurate, which made it worse. "I don't know who you are, but you need to step back behind the perimeter tape right now, or I will have you removed." The old man took a slow sip from his thermos. Steam curled around his face and vanished into the fog. "Name's Fenton," he said, as if Noonan had asked politely. "Douglas Fenton. I live about 4 kilometers down the Folly Lake Road. I'm not here to cause you trouble, Corporal. I'm here because a boy is lost in my woods, and your dogs are telling you something that none of you are listening to." Behind them, Riva let out a single sharp bark. It was not directed at the tree line. It was directed at Fenton. Firth's head snapped up. In 15 years of handling, she had never heard Riva bark at a civilian, at a bystander, at anyone who was not a direct and immediate focus of a task. The dog was standing rigid, her ears forward, her tail high and still, not wagging, but held in a posture of absolute attention. She was not alerting to a threat. She was alerting to an authority. The other dogs responded as if a switch had been thrown. Gunner's whine escalated into a series of sharp, insistent vocalizations. Not barking, but something between a cry and a demand. "Fair." Atlas threw himself against the door of his compartment, hard enough to rock the vehicle on its suspension. Volunteer dogs, the Labrador and the Bloodhound, began pulling toward Fenton on their leads, their handlers stumbling forward in surprise. The staging area erupted into chaos. 5 dogs, all acting as if they had been struck by the same bolt of lightning, all oriented toward the same point, an old man in a Carhartt jacket holding a thermos. Handlers were shouting commands that went unheard. Radios were squawking. Foun team leaders were emerging from the fog to see what the commotion was about. Noonan spun on Fenton, his composure cracking like thin ice. "What are you doing? What is this?" Fenton had not moved. He had not flinched, had not stepped back, had not so much as changed the angle of his shoulders. He stood in the center of the canine storm with the same absolute, immovable calm he had carried up the access road. His eyes moved from dog to dog, reading each one, acknowledging each one, the way a commanding officer reviews a formation. "They're not reacting to me," Fenton said quietly. "They're reacting to what I am, as what I was. It's in my scent, my posture, my breathing. I can't turn it off any more than they can ignore it. It's foundational. It's in their blood." Constable Firth was walking toward them now, her lead in one hand, her other hand raised in a calming gesture toward Noonan, watching Fenton since he arrived. She had seen the stillness, the assessment, the utter lack of startle response when the dogs erupted. She had seen his hands, had noticed things that Noonan had not. A thin, white scar running along the webbing between his right thumb and forefinger, exact location where a tracking lead cuts. When a large dog lunges at full force. A flattened knuckle on his left hand. The kind of old fracture you get from a bite sleeve that doesn't hold his eyes. His eyes tracked the dogs with a fluency that took handlers years to develop. He did not watch where they were. He watched where they were about to be. "Corporal," Firth said, her voice measured and careful. "A word." She pulled Noonan aside, just far enough that Fenton couldn't hear, though something in his expression suggested he knew exactly what she was about to say. "Know who that man is," Firth said. "But he's not a civilian, not in any way that matters. Look at how the dogs are responding. That's not agitation. That's recognition. They're treating him like top of the chain of command. And that doesn't happen with someone who's never worked dogs." He shook his head. "He's some old farmer from down the road, Firth. He probably had a German shepherd as a pet. A pet owner doesn't stand like that when 5 working dogs are losing their minds at him. The owner flinches. A pet owner backs up. That man didn't even blink." She paused, choosing her next words with the precision of someone delivering a briefing. "Corporal, I've read the training archives at Innisfail. There was a program in the 80s and 90s, a joint initiative between D&D and the RCMP, codenamed Boreal. It was a deep conditioning protocol for military and police canine units, experimental bonding techniques that went way beyond standard obedience. The dogs that came out of Boreal were different, harder, more intuitive, more connected to their handlers on a level that nobody could fully explain. The program was classified and shut down in '94, and most of the trainers scattered. But the bloodlines, the genetic lines from those dogs, they're still in the system. Riva's grandsire was a Boreal dog. So was Gunner's." Noonan stared at her. "Semlin, you're telling me these dogs recognize this man because their grandparents were trained by someone like him? I'm telling you that whatever signal he carries, whatever marker was imprinted into those foundational bloodlines, these dogs are reading it. And I'm telling you that our dogs have refused to track for the last 2 hours. And that man just told you, without being asked, exactly what they're doing wrong. We have a 9-year-old boy in those woods, Corporal. The clock isn't just loud, it's screaming." Noonan stood very still for a long moment. The fog pressed in around them, muffling the sounds of the search, the distant shouts of the ground teams, the crackle of the radios. He was 27 years old, and he was staring at the limits of his own experience, and he knew it. He walked back to Fenton. The old man was watching Riva, who had stopped barking, and was now sitting at perfect attention, her eyes locked on him with an expression of focused obedience that Firth had spent months trying to achieve. "Mr. Fenton," Noonan said. The anger was gone from his voice, replaced by something raw and difficult. The sound of a young man swallowing his pride because a child's life was worth more than his ego. "You said the dogs are telling us something we're not listening to. They're telling us." Fenton looked at him, and for the first time, something shifted in those gray eyes. A softness, a recognition. Not of the question, but of the courage it had taken to ask it. "The boy isn't on the main trail," Fenton said. He screwed the cap back on his thermos and tucked it inside his jacket. "Your dogs tracked to the tree line and stopped because the scent goes into the gorge. Down, not forward. A drainage culvert that runs under the old logging road about 200 meters in. It's been there since the 50s. Corrugated steel, maybe a meter across. In October, its runoff channels would be mostly dry. A scared kid looking for shelter would crawl right into it. It's warm, it's enclosed, and it smells like earth. To a child, it would feel safe." Noonan looked at the map. There was no culvert marked. "You know about a culvert in the middle of the woods? Because I've walked every meter of this valley for 40 years. And because I know how a lost hep person thinks." The boy didn't wander. He ran. He was scared of the dark. And he ran downhill because downhill is easier. And he found the first enclosed space that felt like a room, and he went in and he stayed. Your dogs know this. That's what they were trying to tell you at the tree line. The scent drops. It goes underground. Training tells them to track on the surface. Their instincts tell them the scent is below them. The conflict is shutting them down. He paused, letting the logic settle. There's a second problem. Velvet is iron. Old, rusted, corrugated iron. It throws off the scent trail. The minerals in the rust create a chemical interference that confuses the dog's olfactory processing. It's like trying to hear a whisper in a room full of static. They can smell the boy, but they can't isolate him. That's why the bloodhound sat down. He could smell everything and nothing at the same time. The detail was staggering. Noonan looked at Firth. She gave a single, small nod. "Can you get the dogs past it?" Noonan asked. Fenton was quiet for a moment. He looked at the tree line, at the fog threading through the spruce and birch like smoke through fingers. He looked at the dogs, all 5 of them still oriented toward him, waiting. "I can try," he said, "but I need to work with your lead dog, a shepherd." "The female." "Riva," Firth said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with something Noonan had never seen in her before. It took him a moment to identify it, bordering on awe. "Her name is Riva." Fenton nodded. "Riva." He said the name once, testing its shape, and the dog's ears flicked forward at the sound. "Good name. Strong. Steady in confined spaces?" "The steadiest I've ever worked." "Then she's the one." Fenton looked at Noonan. "I need your permission, Corporal. And I'll need your trust. What I'm going to do won't look like anything in your training manual." Noonan hesitated for exactly 1 breath. Then he stepped aside and walked toward Riva. He did not rush. He did not extend his hand for the dog to sniff the way a civilian would. He simply walked into her space and stood still, the same way he had stood at the perimeter, and let the dog read him. Riva's nostrils flared, her body trembled, a fine vibration running through her muscles like a current through a wire. She was processing something vast, something encoded in Fenton's scent and bearing that spoke to a layer of her conditioning deeper than any command Firth had ever given her. The hair along her spine rose, not in aggression but in a primal recognition, the way a compass needle swings to north. Fenton knelt, his knees cracked like dry branches, and he let out a small grunt that was the only concession he made to his age. He was eye level with Riva now, and their gazes locked. The dog's trembling slowed and stopped. Her tail dropped to a neutral position. Her pupils dilated. Fenton spoke to her, not a command, a conversation. His voice dropped to a register so low it was almost subsonic, empty fields. A rumble that the handlers could feel in their chests more than hear with their ears. The words were not English. They were not French. They were short, clipped syllables that seemed to bypass the dog's conscious mind entirely and speak to something buried in her marrow. Tak, Vesna, Dolny. Riva's body transformed. The confusion, the anxiety, the conflict between her training and her instincts, all of it dissolved. She dropped into a tracking posture so deep and committed that Firth gasped. The dog's nose went to the ground, and this time, when she hit the tree line, she did not stop. She blew through the invisible barrier like it had never existed, her body low and driving, yes, her movements precise and purposeful. Fenton was right behind her, moving through the woods with a speed and sureness that belied his age and his stoop. Yet he moved through the underbrush the way water moves through rock, finding the gaps, flowing around obstacles, never breaking stride. They followed, her lead in her hand, though Riva was no longer on it. The dog was running free, and she was running for Fenton. They went 200 meters into the trees. The ground sloped sharply downward, the soil turning from packed earth to loose shale, and then Fenton stopped. He held up one hand, palm flat, and Riva froze mid-stride, one paw raised, her entire body quivering with the effort of restraint. Fenton said quietly. Firth looked. At first, she saw nothing but a tangle of fallen birch and dead fern. Then she saw it. a dark, circular opening in the hillside, partially hidden by a collapsed section of the old logging road above it. The corrugated steel culvert, rusted the color of dried blood, its mouth barely wide enough for a man to crawl into. It breathed cold, mineral-scented air into the fog. Riva whined, not the confused whine from earlier. A clear single-note alert, the sound that meant she had found what she was looking for. Firth keyed her radio. "Command, this is Firth. We have a positive alert at the drainage culvert, 200 meters south-southwest of the LKP, deploying for visual confirmation." She looked at Fenton. The old man was already on his knees at the mouth of the culvert, his thermos set aside, his hands braced on the rusted steel. Peered into the darkness, and then in a voice so gentle it barely carried, he called out, "Callum, bud. My name is Doug. I live just down the road. Your mom and dad sent me to find you. You did real good finding this spot. Real good. But it's time to come out now, okay? It's time to go home." Silence. Og pressed in. Firth held her breath. Then, from deep inside the culvert, a small, hoarse voice. "I'm cold." Firth's radio exploded with activity. Noonan's voice, sharp with relief and command, "A. Fields," was dispatching the medical team to their coordinates. Behind her, she could hear the crash of boots through underbrush as the ground team converged. But she did not move because she was watching Douglas Fenton, and what she saw made her throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The old man had closed his eyes. His hands, those scarred, thick-knuckled, impossibly steady hands, were trembling. Just slightly. Just enough. His lips moved in a word she could not hear. And she understood, with a clarity that pierced the fog like sunlight, that this man had spent a lifetime finding people. That he had found them in jungles and deserts and frozen mountain passes. That he had found them alive and he had found them dead. And that each time, whether the outcome was triumph or tragedy, it had cost him something. But here, on his knees in the mud, at the mouth of a rusted culvert in the woods, behind his own home, finding a cold and frightened 9-year-old boy who was alive and speaking is not a small thing to him. It was everything. Callum Price emerged from the culvert 11 minutes later, wrapped in a thermal blanket, clutching a granola bar from Firth's pocket, a face streaked with dirt and tears, and a tentative, bewildered smile. As hypothermic but responsive, dehydrated but uninjured. The paramedics took him, and the staging area erupted into the organized chaos of a successful rescue. Radios chattering, vehicles moving, out dusty fields. The specific electric relief that comes when the worst outcome is averted. In the noise and the movement, Noonan found Fenton standing at the edge of the tree line, watching the ambulance pull away. The old man had retrieved his thermos and was holding it in both hands, absorbing its warmth. Ava was sitting at his feet, leaning against his leg, and Firth was making no effort to retrieve her. "Mr. Fenton." Noonan's voice was thick. He stood at attention, a reflex he did not consciously choose, his body recognizing an authority that his training had never prepared him for. "I owe you an apology. I was wrong. I was dismissive, and I was arrogant, and I almost let that cost a child his life." Fenton looked at him the way a man looks at a photograph of his younger self, with affection and a little bit of sadness and complete understanding. "You weren't arrogant, Corporal. You were scared. There's a difference. Arrogance doesn't listen. You listened. That's not right away, but you listened before it mattered. And that's the only part that counts." He took a sip from his thermos and looked at Riva, still pressed against his leg. "At good people and good dogs. Trust them more than your clipboard. The clipboard will tell you what should be happening. The dogs will tell you what is." Noonan swallowed hard. "The words you used, Eva. Tak Vesna Dolny. What were they?" "Old words," Fenton said. Mostly, mixed with some German. Foundation commands from the Boreal Protocol. They don't mean sit or stay or track. They mean something closer to trust me. The ground is true. Go down. The dog's deepest conditioning. Below the obedience layer. Below the task layer. Down to where the bond lives. A working dog in the Canadian system carries a trace of that programming in their blood. Most handlers never have to reach that deep. It's when the surface training fails. When the dog is caught between what it's been taught and what it knows. Sometimes you have to go to the foundation and start from there. He paused and looked at the fog, beginning to thin. The October sun burning through in pale golden shafts that turned the spruce needles to bronze. I learned those words from a man named Makovec, Czech trainer, Escher, brought over in '86 to help build the program. He was 70 years old, and he could drop a Churchiang Malinois with a whisper. He told me something once that I've never forgotten. Fenton's voice went quiet, the way voices go quiet when they are carrying the weight of the dead. He said, "The dog does not obey you because you are strong. He obeys you because you are true. Be true, and the dog will follow you into fire." He straightened up, and for a moment the stoop was gone, and Noonan saw the man he had been. He owned Dasty Fields. Tall, square-shouldered, formidable. A man who had walked into places that did not appear on maps and walked out again carrying secrets that would never be told. Then the moment passed, and he was just an old man in rubber boots finishing his tea. "I should get back," Fenton said. "I've got a fence that needs mending before the snow comes. And my daughter is bringing the grandkids up from Halifax this weekend. Thomas the oldest, I'd take her ice fishing if the lake freezes early." He reached down and placed his hand on Riva's head. The dog closed her eyes, pressing into his palm, and her tail swept the ground in slow, contented arcs. He held the contact for 3 seconds, no more, and then withdrew his hand and walked away. Constable Firth came to stand beside Noonan. They watched Fenton walk down the access road, his boots scuffing the gravel, his thermos tucked under his arm, the fog parting around him and closing behind him like a curtain. "Boreal," Noonan said. "It's not a question." Firth nodded. "I pulled the archives once years ago, out of curiosity. Most of it was redacted. But there were names. Extra Fields, the lead trainer for the Atlantic program, was listed only as Fenton. No rank, no unit, no service record attached. Just a name and a note that read operational clearance revoked upon program termination. All records sealed by order of the Chief of the Defense Staff." Noonan absorbed this in silence. "He's not in any database," Firth continued. "Men like that, when they're done, they just disappear. As they go back to wherever they came from, and they fix fences, and they take their grandkids fishing, and they never tell a soul what they did. Ever. And then one day a boy goes missing in their backyard, and for 15 minutes the ghost comes out of the fog and does what ghosts do." She paused. "I feel. Finds what's lost." They stood together in the thinning fog, watching until the old man reached the highway and turned south toward Folly Lake Road, growing smaller with each step, his figure blurring into the gray and gold of the morning until he was indistinguishable from the landscape itself. Just another feature of the Cobequid Hills, as permanent and as quiet as the stone beneath them. Eva sat at the tree line. For a long time after he was gone, her nose lifted to the air, breathing in the last traces of something ancient and foundational and true. Then she turned, walked back to Firth, Fisherman Fields, and pressed her head against her handler's knee, ready to work again. Down the access road, the ambulance carrying Callum Price turned onto the highway toward the Colchester East Hants Health Center. It's bright against the retreating fog. As in the back seat, the boy was wrapped in blankets and asking for his mother, and the paramedic was telling him he was brave. And outside the window, the Nova Scotia hills rolled past in their ancient, unhurried procession of spruce and granite and sky. On Folly Lake Road, Douglas Fenton walked home. The fog was lifting, and the sun was warm on his face. and his fence needed mending, and his granddaughter was coming on Friday. He did not look back. He had never been a man who looked back. The work was the work, and when it was done, you walked away and let the silence close behind you. Because the silence was where men like him belonged, in the space between what the world saw and what was true. Quiet and steady and foundational as bedrock, carrying the old words in their bones until the day someone needed to hear them again.